Picture Toronto during World War II, bustling with activity but facing new challenges as the city expanded. While war raged on, another kind of planning was brewing. You see, even before the war, Toronto had its eyes on the surrounding areas. They knew they were connected, and they wanted a better way to manage it all. Back in the 1920s, as the city grew and stretched its boundaries, people started talking about setting up a way to handle this growth. But it wasn't until the war that things really kicked into gear. The chaos of wartime made everyone realize they needed a plan. So regional planning became the name of the game. But why? Well, it was partly because Toronto had been pondering this for years, and partly because everyone felt the urgency of the war. They knew they had to figure out how to make things work better, not just for now, but for the future too. And so, in the midst of the turmoil, regional planning took root, shaping the path forward for Toronto and its surrounding areas. The economic boom triggered by the war created an urgent need for planning in the early 1940s, with large wartime industries sprouting across the metropolitan area, like Canada Small Arms, Victoria Aircraft, and research enterprises. The demand for coordinated infrastructure, land use, and housing became pressing. These facilities, bustling with activity, attracted thousands of workers who sought to live close to their workplace, and this only intensified the need for metropolitan coordination. Simultaneously, the war fostered a growing acceptance of government intervention among Canadians. Government involvement permeated daily life during the war, from setting prices and rationing resources to controlling labor markets. The successful management of these interventions led to a notable shift in Canadian politics towards the left, with increased support for the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. In Ontario, the CCF's near victory in the 1943's election prompted Conservative Premier George Drew to announce his government's commitment to planning in 1944. This marked a significant departure, as planning had traditionally been associated with the radical left, highlighting the changing political landscape influenced by wartime experiences. In 1943, Toronto saw its first regional plan come to life, led by a team of consultants working with the Toronto City Planning Board. While some may link this plan to the rise of planning popularity and left-leaning politics at the time, its roots actually go back to 1942, when the planning board was established and the plan was set in motion. Although the plan aimed to address citywide issues, it mainly focused on Toronto itself, which had its own set of challenges not at all related to the war. It wasn't until after the war that the true impact of planning efforts was truly felt. Despite its unclear beginnings, the 1943 Master Plan for the City of Toronto and environs represented a significant milestone. It was the first time such a large-scale planning effort had ever been undertaken in Toronto, and it marked a notable achievement in urban development for the city. The plan is often credited to Eugene Faludi, an architect from Italy who came to Toronto after World War II began. Faludi had worked in Europe's top architectural circles in the 1930s, but had to leave Italy because he was Jewish, and well, we know what happened. He first went to England and then he settled in Toronto. The plan mainly focused on making the city better by updating downtown, adding more parks and open spaces, and fixing up rundown areas. But it also looked at some important regional issues. It suggested a big expansion of the suburbs around the city, aiming for a connected, compact layout with curved streets and a lot of open areas. The plan called for new highways and faster transit, both in the city and the suburbs. And although the 1943 Master Plan did bring in some new ideas from international planning, like the modern neighborhood concept and expressway networks, it didn't have a big impact on how the region actually developed. That's because the Toronto City Planning Board, who made the plan, wasn't really a government body. They didn't have the power or money to make their ideas happen. You see, only the city council could do that, and they weren't very interested in the plan. However, eventually the city council would ask city staff to make a more practical plan instead. Even though the planning board kept working for a few more years, the council paid less attention to them over time. Some of the ideas from the plan did show up in later plans, showing its long-term importance, but the actual master plan quietly faded away. This marked the end of a time when plans were made by citizen groups rather than the government. And contrary to what one might expect, Toronto's regional planning roots actually stem more from provincial initiatives than from the city itself. Surprisingly, Toronto hasn't exactly been the poster child for collaboration with its neighboring jurisdiction when it comes to regional planning or shared service. But here's the twist. In 1946, Ontario flips the script by enacting a groundbreaking planning act. And this legislation empowers municipalities to craft official plans for their own areas, shaking up the region's planning landscape. Suddenly, several municipalities, including Toronto, rushed to the drawing board to create their own plans. The Planning Act had a cool feature. It allowed different towns and cities to team up and create joint planning boards. So not long after this law was passed, a bunch of professionals and concerned citizens, mostly from Toronto, got together and formed the Toronto Suburban Planning Board. Later on, it was renamed Toronto and York. And this board was in charge of planning not just for Toronto, but also for 12 nearby towns and villages. The Toronto and York Planning Board isn't widely recognized, even among those who follow these matters closely. This is mainly because it was eventually replaced by the more effective Metropolitan Toronto Planning Board, and it didn't achieve much that's visible today. It didn't create a regional plan, enforce any land use, or invest in infrastructure, but it still mattered. Firstly, it was clearly a regional planning body, not just focused on the city's growth. This shows us that both municipalities in Toronto area, and perhaps more importantly, the province of Ontario, recognize the importance of planning for regional urban growth. The Toronto and York Planning Board may not have grabbed headlines, but it played a crucial role in shaping future plans and investment in the regions. One notable example is the 1949 Metropolitan Water and Sewer Study conducted by Gore and Story, an engineering firm. This study laid the groundwork for a massive expansion of pipe infrastructure in metropolitan Toronto during the 1950s. Additionally, the corporation undertook the widening and extension of numerous major roads in both established and emerging urban areas. Between 1955 and 1970, the Metro invested nearly $500 million in expanding public infrastructure, mainly financed through bond sales in New York. Initially, government subsidies were minimal, until the later periods, and also Ontario supported the building of Highway 401. This infrastructure development, particularly the express network, initially faced little opposition, but by the mid-1960s, opposition grew, leading to a halt in expressway construction by the end of the decade. However, piped services proceeded as planned with little resistance. By the mid-1970s, the era of big public projects in Toronto, well, it was over. Since then, no major undertaking like those from the 1950s to 1970s have happened. Some smaller projects like extending water services and building new roads were done, but nothing as massive as before. Reasons include competing needs for money, environmental concerns, and people wanting more say in local decisions. The long-term consequences of the shift remain uncertain, but it's evident that Toronto still heavily relies on infrastructure built between 1955 and 1975. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought of this video. What do you think about Toronto's urban planning? And if you did enjoy this video, please make sure you like and subscribe. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and who knows, you might be the 1,001. I'll see you on the next one.